Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to dehydrate ground beef. I'm Rebecca from StockingMyPantry.com. In this video, I'm going to cover 6 aspects of dehydrating ground beef, and by the end of this video, you'll know how to dehydrate ground beef with confidence. Here are the 6 points that I'll cover. First, why dehydrate ground beef? I'm going to cover 4 main benefits of dehydrating ground beef. Next, I'm going to talk about choosing the best ground beef for dehydrating, and I'll include the type of ground beef that I used for making this video. Number 3, I'll cover how to prepare ground beef for dehydrating. And I'm going to share with you the 4 steps that I take every time that I dehydrate ground beef, and these steps pretty much guarantee success. I'll share with you the dehydration process. I'm also going to talk about how to store dehydrated ground beef, and then finally, how to use dehydrated ground beef. Now let's talk about the benefits of dehydrating ground beef. One significant benefit is that it serves as a hedge against inflation. As food prices continue to rise, preserving ground beef allows you to stock up on it at today's prices, effectively helping you manage your grocery budget in the long term. Now, I'll admit that right now it doesn't seem like ground beef is inexpensive, but it probably is only going to get more expensive. So it's best to go ahead and stock up on it at today's prices and preserve it, because it will likely be more expensive in the future. Okay, number 2. In light of concerns about climate change, there's many governments worldwide that are implementing restrictions on beef and other animal product production. And these measures are likely to cause a further increase in prices and may also limit availability in the future. So by dehydrating ground beef now, you can ensure a stable supply in your pantry regardless of what is going on in the world and what market fluctuations there are, and availability and all of that. Okay, number 3, ground beef is shelf stable. Now this is of course true of canned ground beef, but I actually really like the texture of dehydrated ground beef better than canned ground beef. And also there's more ways to store dehydrated ground beef compared to canned ground beef. So for example, I like storing it in mason jars, but you can also store it in Mylar bags. And also with canned food, you can't really put the can laying down on the side, but if it's a mason jar full of dehydrated food, you can, and that makes it a little easier for things like storing it under a bed or in a box that you're going to take somewhere, or that type of thing. Number 4, cooking with dehydrated ground beef offers a level of convenience that's hard to beat. And since it's already cooked before dehydration, it simplifies the meal prep process. So you can easily rehydrate it, or you can just dump it in soups or casserole, sauces, or any other dish that calls for ground beef, saving you valuable time in the kitchen. And I also like being able to use dehydrated ground beef in meals in jars. And another thing that I've experienced lately is that, my husband or I will be hungry and we want to make just a couple of tacos, and it's so easy to grab a jar of my dehydrated ground beef and take out just what I need for tacos and then reseal the jar. And this is way easier and more economical than having to thaw a pound of ground beef and then cooking it when all I need is a small amount. In short, learning how to dehydrate ground beef not only provides a way to preserve and extend the shelf life of your meat, but it also offers financial benefits and enhances the ease of meal preparation. So now let's talk about selecting the right type of ground beef. Selecting the right type of ground beef is a critical step in the dehydration process. Now, ideally, you should opt for lean ground beef that has a maximum of 15% fat content, such as 85-15 ground beef. And this is because fat can go rancid over time, and having less fat in your meat reduces the risk significantly, ensuring that your dehydrated ground beef maintains its quality for a longer period of time. In this video, I'm using 93% lean grass-fed ground beef. Now, grass-fed beef isn't required, but it tends to be leaner and healthier, so that's what I chose. Now remember, when it comes to dehydrating ground beef, the leaner the better, and your future self will thank you for making a health-conscious and practical choice that leads to tastier, longer-lasting dehydrated ground beef. So again, you don't have to buy grass-fed, you don't have to buy 93% lean, but you do want a maximum 15% fat content in the ground beef that you're going to dehydrate. Now let's get into how to prepare ground beef for dehydrating. So what I like to do is I start by gently browning the ground beef in a skillet, and the key word is gentle. As you can see in the top photo, I'm using a medium-low heat. So my goal here is to cook the ground meat without getting a hard crust on the outside. So that's why I use a lower heat. So as it cooked, I turned it fairly frequently so it would cook evenly. And I continued cooking and turning until no pink remained. And this ensured that the meat is fully cooked, which is vital as a dehydration process does not cook the meat, but rather removes the moisture content. So you want it fully cooked before you dehydrate it. And by the way, for some reason, I failed to take a photo of it when it was fully cooked, but thankfully, I think you all know what cooked ground beef looks like. So in spite of the fact that you still see a whole bunch of pink there, know that I cooked it all the way. Okay, now let's go on to the second step. The next step that you'll take is draining off the grease and rinsing it with hot water. So you want to rinse it until the water runs clear. You can see that there's water running out the bottom of the colander that I'm using, and I kept rinsing and stirring it until the water was clear, no longer looked cloudy or greasy. Now, by the way, use whatever you have, but I do recommend that you get a colander that sits above the sink rather than in it. And as you can see from the photo in the lower left, the colander isn't sitting in the sink. And this allows the water to run through it without the water pooling up into the colander. And I'll leave a link to the colander that I use. I like it because it's collapsible, so it doesn't take up much space in my cabinet. It also comes in different colors. I happen to have the blue one. But what I really like too is that the handles expand to fit a lot of different size sinks. And also it was pretty inexpensive. Now, if you don't have a colander like this and you don't want to pick one up, you can just use a regular colander. Just hold it up while you run the water through it. But I like a colander that is held above the sink because it keeps my hands free so that I can stir the meat while the water's running through it. And when you stir the meat while the water's running through it, it helps to make sure that it's rinsed well. Okay, now let's go on to the third step. The third step is to boil the ground beef for about 5 minutes. So boiling the ground beef accomplishes a few things. The first thing is that it helps to flush out additional grease. Now, if you look at the upper right photo, you can see that there is some grease in the water. Now, this is in spite of me starting with lean ground beef, after cooking it, draining it, and rinsing it with hot water. So there was still some fat in the meat in spite of those things. Now, one mistake that I did make is that the pan that I used barely held the meat and the water. And this made it harder for me to boil it without making a mess. Now, I could have and probably should have swapped out to a larger pot, but I was in a hurry and so I stuck with it. So I'm sharing that with you just to encourage you to use a larger pot than you think you might need. But the bottom line is you're going to boil the meat for about 5 minutes, and then that helps reduce the additional fat. Now, the second reason for boiling the meat is that it softens it a bit and makes it easier to rehydrate it. Now, dehydrated ground beef has a reputation for being hard to rehydrate, and some people even call it gravel. Now, in my experience, my dehydrated ground beef has a really good texture after rehydrating it. And I think it's because of this extra step of boiling it. So not only does the boiling it help to reduce the amount of fat that's on it, it also softens it, and that will make it easier to rehydrate. So in my opinion, both from the perspective of getting rid of the excess grease and having a better texture when rehydrating it, it makes it worth this two-step cooking process. Okay, now let's go on to the final prep step. Okay, as you saw in the one photo, there was still grease in the water, and this happened because through the boiling process, the fat that was in the center of the meat was released. So once again, after boiling, you rinse the meat with hot water until the water runs clear. Okay, now let's get into the actual dehydration process. So the next step is to spread the cooked ground beef onto your dehydrator trays in a single layer. Now, you either need to use the fruit leather trays or the mesh liner things on your dehydrator trays, because at least on most dehydrators, the holes in the trays are large enough that the ground beef will fall through without the mesh or the fruit leather tray. And the mesh screens are definitely better because they allow airflow, so choose that if at all possible. Now, if you don't have either of those, you can put like parchment paper down, cut it to fit, but then that doesn't let the airflow. So if possible, use the mesh liners. Now, as you're putting the ground meat onto the trays, you may notice that there are some larger clumps of ground beef. You want to make sure to break up those into smaller bits. Now in the top photo, you can see that the clumps are now small bits. So in the previous one, you saw they were kind of big, and I broke those up and they're all smaller bits now. Okay, now let's talk about temperature and timing. You want to set your dehydrator to a temperature of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And this temperature is high enough to safely dehydrate the meat, and also since the meat is already cooked, a high temperature won't reduce any of the meat's nutrition. As far as the length of time, you'll expect to dehydrate your ground beef for approximately 4 to 6 hours. However, keep in mind that the exact time may vary depending on factors like the thickness of your meat layer, your dehydrator, and the level of humidity in your home. So I'm going to show you how long it took mine to dehydrate and a little bit about what it looked like in the process. So this is what the top tray of the ground beef looked like after 3 hours in the dehydrator. Now keep in mind, in this particular video, I used my Nesco dehydrator that is one of the stackable ones. And this was the tray that was closest to the heat source and the fan. As you can see from the photo, the beef was dark brown in color and it was also pretty crumbly. There was some very little moisture on the meat in the top tray. Very little, if any, actually. In contrast, here's a close-up of the bottom tray after 3 hours in the dehydrator. And just as a point of reference, I had 5 trays of meat in the dehydrator. Okay, so this was the bottom layer. Now the top layer was dark and crumbly, and the bottom layer, you can see that there's some dark bits on the meat, but there was still quite a bit of moisture. It definitely wasn't dehydrated all the way through. So at this point, I rotated the trays so that the bottom trays would be closer to the heat source and the fan. Now, I actually have 2 different dehydrators. I have 3 dehydrators. I have 2 of these Nesco stackable ones, and I also have a Cosori, which is a cabinet style dehydrator. And if I had used my Cosori, I wouldn't have needed to rotate the trays. Now, I decided to use my Nesco because I only have 3 of the mesh liners for my Cosori, and I was doing the 5 trays of ground beef. And so I happen to have a lot of the mesh liners and things like that for my Nesco, and so that's what I used. Now, the stackable dehydrators like the Nesco work fine, and they're less expensive. So if you're looking to buy a dehydrator and your funds are limited, I definitely recommend that. But just plan to rotate the trays about halfway through the dehydration time. So after I rotated the trays, I continued to dehydrate the ground beef for an additional 2 hours. Now this is what the ground beef looked like after 5 hours in the dehydrator. So what I did was I dumped all of the dehydrated ground beef into a bowl that I lined with a flour sack towel. I actually use these flour sack towels quite a bit when I'm dehydrating anything that could have, fat in it, such as cheese or in this case, meat. And I do this so that the towels can absorb any grease that may still be on the meat. But as you can maybe tell from the photo, the meat was as dry as a bone and there was no grease spots on the towel at all. And you can see how dark the meat became, which is totally normal when dehydrating ground beef. It's going to look a very, very dark brown. And so this was, again, after 5 hours in the dehydrator. It was completely dry. So now let's talk about storing dehydrated ground beef. The final step is to do what it's called conditioning the dehydrated ground beef. Now, conditioning is a way to make sure that whatever you dehydrated is completely dehydrated and there's absolutely no moisture left in it whatsoever. Now, as you can see, I put the meat into mason jars, and remember that I started with 4 pounds of ground beef, and you can see that the four jars are pretty full, but they're not super full. And that was intentional because when you condition something, you shake it a couple of times each day and observe it to see if you see any signs of moisture. So you need to have a little space in the jars so that you can shake it. Now, when you're looking for moisture, you're going to check to see if there's any condensation. If so, that's a sign that there's still moisture. Or if any of the ground beef sticks to the jar, that's a sign there's still moisture. So if you see anything like that, you put the ground beef back into the dehydrator for a couple of hours to complete the dehydration process. Now, in my case, the ground beef was so dry and crumbly, I wasn't concerned about it being fully dehydrated, whether or not it was fully dehydrated, but I still observed it for a day or two before moving on to the final step. Okay, so once I was convinced that it was fully dehydrated, I vacuum sealed the jars. Now, I tend to vacuum seal everything I dehydrate, but in most cases that's not essential. For instance, if you dehydrate something like potatoes, while vacuum sealing will help them to last longer in storage, it's not a big deal if you don't do it. But with meat, it's a totally different story. Dehydrated meat could go rancid within a couple weeks if you don't vacuum seal it. So I highly recommend that you vacuum seal the ground meat. And in this photo, this is what I used. I used my Food Saver handheld vacuum sealer and mason jar attachments. Now there's some other brands that are available which are totally fine to use, and you can also use oxygen absorbers. Now, if you can't do either of those, then I recommend storing the dehydrated ground beef in the freezer. By the way, if you're dehydrating ground beef and you want to take it backpacking or on a trip or something, it's going to be fine not being vacuum sealed for a couple of weeks. But please do vacuum seal it or put it in the freezer if you plan to store it long term. Okay, now let's talk about how to use your dehydrated ground beef. Now, the great thing is that it's super easy to use dehydrated ground beef. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it's really a convenience food item. And so I'm going to talk, though, about how to use it now. So in the top image, I've added hot water to dehydrated ground beef in mason jars. I had the mason jar about half full of the dehydrated ground beef, and I poured in really hot water and I put the lid on. And it took less than 10 minutes to fully rehydrate. So now on the image on the top, I've added water and taco seasoning to the ground beef and simmered it. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, at least the way that I make tacos, typically I start with fresh ground beef and, cook it and drain it, add taco seasoning and water and simmer it. So using the dehydrated ground beef is actually much faster than starting with fresh, and it turns out great. So, you add in your water, your taco seasoning, simmer it, and it comes out perfectly. And of course, you can always dump it in a pot of chili that you're making without rehydrating it first, or soup or that type of thing, anything that's real saucy. You could also just put it into spaghetti sauce without rehydrating it first and maybe just add a little bit of extra water. Now, if you want to substitute dehydrated ground beef for fresh, you'll need about 2 to 2.5 cups of dehydrated ground beef in any recipe that calls for a pound of ground beef. Well, I hope that you found this information helpful. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you would like this video, and if you haven't already done so, if you would subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.